welcome everybody. I see we've got a few people here joining us for our King of King Court EGL Book Club. So thank you everybody for joining us. When you join, your cameras and your microphones will automatically be off, but please unmute yourself if you have anything that you want to add, any questions, if you want to jump into the conversation. Don't hesitate to unmute yourself. And if you want to have your camera on or off, that's completely up to you guys. I want to take a few minutes to give a little intro here. I'll give you a little bit of an idea of what our agenda looks like for today, and then we'll just kind of take it from there. So welcome on behalf of Pop Culture Classroom, Denver Pop Culture Con, and the Excellence in Graphic Literature Awards. My name is Will Whitaker. I am a teacher with Pop Culture Classroom, and I'm here joined with Matt in Pop Culture Classroom, as well as Jack Bauer here. Let me go ahead and give a little introduction for Jack. So Jack is a teen services librarian at the Berkeley Public Library. He has been heavily engaged in working with comics in libraries for over a decade. He was the co-host in the library with a comic book podcast, the organizer of the Berkeley Comic Arts Festival in 2013, and has put together events for dozens of comic pros. He also does all of the GN collection development for the Berkeley Public Library system, and his first comic book was 1988's Wolverine number 17.
I forgot that I put that in there.
Yeah, and that's an excellent one.
Yeah, it is.
So here in just a moment, I'm going to turn everything over to Jack, who's going to introduce the book and discuss a little bit about the Excellence in Graphic Literature Awards. We're going to have a little bit of time for questions directly for Jack. And then for the remainder of the time, we're going to open it up for a discussion. I've got a lot of really specific things to talk about in this book, but I'm also very eager to hear what ideas you guys have coming in today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jack.
Hi, thanks everyone. So first of all, can you guys see me? Because I can't see myself. I can see you, but I can't see myself. Am I showing up there?
You are, and I'm going to spotlight you so that you are what we're seeing right now.
Bam. All right. Oh, there I am. Okay. So, yeah, my name's Jack. I'm from Berkeley Public Library. I was the chair of the young adult category for the Excellence in Graphic Literature Award this year. And this book, King of King Court, was our nonfiction winner. When we were looking at these books, and trying to decide on what was a winner, we were looking at a variety of criteria, both the quality of the book, the way the story was told, the importance of the story being told, the different social aspects and social diversity that was on display in the book, as well as what we thought to be kind of its educational or its literary merit. Was this a book that you could bring into a classroom? Was this a book that you could bring into a library and have a really robust conversation about it? So those are some of the things that we were thinking about when we were going to pick a book for this prize. This book and I think for the nonfiction award, we ended up looking at 10 or so different titles. And this book and our second place book were incredibly close. It was an incredibly close call. And part of the reason why I think it had to do with some factors that were external to both of the books, which I'll get into a little bit. So this book, there were 32 possible points that any given reviewer could assign to a book. When we were going through and we were doing our scoring. So out of 32 points, King of King Court had an average of 24.5 points, which was pretty low. Like our fiction prize was sort of much more universally loved than our nonfiction prize within the context of the 5 or so reviewers that we were talking to. So 24.5 was the average score for King of King Court, and our second place book was a book called Fever Year by Don Brown, and Fever Year was a much more sort of reporterly book about the Spanish flu, the 1919 flu that devastated the country. Yeah, and if we had been reviewing the books a month or two later than we did, given the parallels to what was going on then and what is going on now, I wonder if Fever Year wouldn't have edged out King of King Court, because I remember while I was reading Fever Year in like February or March, yeah, I guess it would have been February. While I was reading Fever Year in February and reading about this flu, I'm like, oh man, that sounds really tough. I don't know how these people could have made it through this. And then, a month later, yeah, look, we're living through it. So so I don't know. That's just it might have just been a matter of timing why this book won, why this book ultimately took the prize and not Fever Year. Another one of the reasons why I think that that King of King Court was a little bit contentious among the reviewers was that several of us, if not the majority of us, had been jurors for the same prize last year. And last year we gave the award to a book called Hey Kiddo by Jarrett Krasovska, which is a memoir that Jarrett Krasovska wrote about his broken family, his family that was broken by trauma and addiction, and how he persevered through that personal difficulty to become a successful cartoonist. So the parallels between those two books are quite strong, and I know that there were a couple of reviewers who in their comments said, I would have given King Court a higher score, but I didn't. I personally did not want to give the prize to a book that was so similar to the one that won last year. And then for myself personally, I did not respond to Hey Kiddo quite the same way that I responded to King of King Court, and that's me speaking personally, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But the things that stood out about King of King Court for me and for a lot of the other reviewers were the really cinematic storytelling of it. There are some scenes in this book where it almost doesn't feel like it was drawn. It feels like it had a cinematographer. It's so filmic in the way that your perspective moves through a scene, especially some of the long silent passages in the book. In the way that Travis Dandro really takes advantage of, kind of like the page turns like a big splash page with like a big climactic or dramatic moment. The way that he uses silent beats, I think the way that he uses silence in this book is unparalleled. Maybe the other person that comes to mind that can use silence that well is maybe like Adrian Tomine. But it's just his mastery of the pacing of scenes and the movement of his camera and the staging of big events. I think that was the part of it that I think I responded to the most. Like I was so sucked in reading this book, and I felt it in a very visceral way, just because of his mastery of the form. I really appreciated the sense of place that this book had. All of the environments felt very lived in, and it made class issues, and it made sort of the fallout from some of the trauma and some of the big societal issues that this family is dealing with feel all that more real, feel all that more immediate, and feel all that more lived in. So that was another aspect of the book that really blew me away, and I think all of the reviewers responded to that. As far as the comparisons to Hey Kiddo, I mean, it maybe is a little bit unfair for an audience who just has an experience with this book, who hasn't read that other book yet, to spend too much time talking about a comparison. But for me, I think one of the reasons why I did not respond to Hey Kiddo as well, even though it was a really beloved book, I think it won or was nominated for a National Book Award. So it was a really highly regarded book. For me, I felt so locked into the author's perspective. It was such a personal book that it, I felt like I knew that author very well. I knew what he'd experienced very well, but I didn't really know many of the other characters in the book. And one of the reasons why I think King of Kingport is so strong and is such a beautiful and such a humane book is the way that it gets us into David's head, and the way that it lets us experience the things that David is experiencing. That to me is such an incredible act of compassion on the part of Travis Dandro, who lived this, to be able to take the time and extend his empathy and his understanding to this man who abused and terrorized his family over the course of years, I think is an incredibly powerful thing. I don't know if there is forgiveness in this book. The ending of the book leaves it a little bit ambiguous as to whether, as to how Travis feels about it all now, but there's definitely an attempt to understand, and I see that in the ways that that he illustrates some of David's hallucinations, the way that he really spells out the ways that David's trauma is related to David's mental health, which is related to David's addiction, which creates this horrible spiral for him throughout the course of the book, that leads him to crime, that leads him to prison, that leads him to alienating his family, and ultimately leads to his death. Travis Dandro did not have to include that. He could have fixed the book entirely from his perspective. He could have just let us feel the trauma that he and his family endured, and I think it still would have been a very powerful book. But the way that he opens up David's perspective and allows us that chance to understand him and to empathize with him just a little bit. I mean, David is still an enigma, and I think part of, like the glasses and the mustache that he always has keeps him at a bit of a remove from us, but he still allows us to sort of see things from David's perspective, and that for me is really what elevates this to a great work of art. So that was one of the things that I just really responded to, and I guess I'll wait a minute. Never mind. I want to leave the rest for later, but just go back and retouch on, as far as like, why is this an important book for right now? I think that feeling of empathy is incredibly important and should inform and motivate our responses to some of the societal problems that are brought up in this book of addiction, trauma, mental health, abuse, and also the clarity with which he connected all of that, the clarity with which he made that argument, where it's like no one part of this stands on its own. That's also something that I think that we as a society have to recognize. And we're going to be entering into a section of American history where we're going to see a lot of these sort of compounded problems with people's mental health, with people's economic stability, with people's general health, with people's safety, like coming up more and more in our society, and we're gonna have to deal with it. And I think that this is kind of a beautiful model for how we can understand it and how that spirit of empathy can inform our approach. So that was, those were some of my big takeaways from the book, sort of my headline level takeaways. And yeah, I guess if there are other questions about how we as reviewers approached it, what some of the other titles we looked at were, sort of our methodology for what we did, like I would be happy to hear it. I will go back and I'll add really quickly, you know, because we were so close between two books, between King of King Court and Fever Year, with King of King Court having just like a slight mathematical advantage, we did in the group talk about whether we wanted to go back and reevaluate the two books just on their own terms. And ultimately, as a group, we decided not to, that we were comfortable with the choice that we picked, and with sort of the blind numerical will of the group. But that was something that we entertained, just because it was such a tight decision. So.
Great. So yeah, I think right now I'd like to open up the floor for anybody who has questions directly for Jack, especially about related to this process or anything that he's spoken on so far.
Everybody's still muted.
Yeah,
I think we had one question from Adam in the chat.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So Adam says, you mentioned that Fever Year would have likely won if it was up for award post-COVID. What do you think jurors might have been responding to during the selection process in the book at the time you read it? Is there anything beyond the page happening in the world? And I think you touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. You know, it was February, so all of those concerns about how an airborne coronavirus might spread among a population were, like, I remember reading it like with the news on my computer screen. Like I was reading at the desk at work, right? And I had New York Times up on my computer screen, and I was reading the book, and like I was seeing the parallels, you know, between like what was coming up on the New York Times and what I was seeing on the book. Ultimately, I think that the storytelling in King of King Court was just so much stronger than Fever Year. And I have read and really liked and really appreciated some of Don Brown's other works. The year before, last year when I was on this award, his book on Syrian refugees was one of the books that we reviewed, and like that is a killer book. And I think what was missing in Fever Year that he did so well in the Syrian refugee book was just that humanity. It's like it's very much reporting, and there's not a whole lot of personal stories to connect to, and for me that was one of the things that kind of pushed Fever Year down a little bit, at least in my reviewing. But yeah, I mean, I would and maybe should reread it, just because I think that I probably have some new perspective on what a pandemic looks like in real life. So.
And then I had a question for you, because before we got started and before we hit record, you had mentioned something that, you know, as a teen services librarian, you know, as kind of an expert in your field, you're not sure that you would put this in your teen category, that it almost feels a little bit more adult to you. Yeah,
I didn't put it in my teen category. Like, you know, that's I don't know if you can see it. That's an adult call number on there. When I bought copies for my library, I bought them adult after reading it for the prize, and that mostly has to do, like, and again, this is all personal, and as librarians, it all gets super subjective, especially especially working in a field like comics, where there's a great amount of interest and not necessarily a great amount of sort of codified, time-tested professional guidance on how we handle these materials. But, you know, for me, it was really about the tone of King of King Court. And particularly the very bleak way that it ends, where, you know, it ends with David's suicide, and I don't think there's another word of dialogue between like him ODing in the field, and they go to his funeral, and Travis like has this happy memory of him, and that's the end of the book. And we kind of don't know what happens to Travis after that, you know? And whereas, again, like to refer back to the previous year's book, Hey Kiddo, which dealt with very similar themes, that book was very clearly about the author's overcoming of that trauma in a way that King Court just was not. That was a book about the trauma.
Yeah, it's funny you bring that up, because like as I read it, you know, King of King Court almost seems like an adult processing their trauma, right?
Totally,
whereas Hey Kiddo was more of that processing had been done already, and it was more about his experience as a teen, right? And how he felt and how he dealt with those things as a teen. So I kind of get those different views there.
Yeah.
Looks like we have a question from Bruce here. He's wondering, were the other books in the nonfiction category more like history or science? And therefore, did the group respond more to this book in Fever Year because it had personality and characterization?
You know, I think it was pretty split. A couple of the ones that, like just off the top of my head, like thinking back to other books that we read, one was a book about a young woman doing the drive up Route 66. So that book definitely did have a lot of personality. It had a lot of her in it. It had a lot of her perspective and her interests. And then another book that we read was somebody who was doing like a comics adaptation of Civil War Diaries. So turning this like very, you know, this very staid and very historical and very, you know, it's definitely like a primary document into these almost like lighthearted comics where it was like maintaining a lot of the original author's voice, but then like drawing gags into it and stuff, which was, it was a really interesting juxtaposition of like straight history and then these kind of like comic flourishes. You know, and neither of those were bad books, but you know, King Court was great.
Yeah.
But I think that there was a really good variety of you know, more straight historical and more sort of narrative and personal books.
And Bruce has a follow-up question here, which is kind of something I have in my notes a little bit. You know, speaking of comparisons, how do you think this lines up with the book Blankets or other Craig Thompson works? Or, you know, I would just add to that a little bit, or any sort of autobiographical graphic novel work. I think the comparison to Blankets is, I think, a really good one. It definitely reminded me.
I think that's a really good one too. Yeah.
Even Fun Home a little bit. I got some feelings of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, what do you think on that in terms of comparisons to some of these other big autobiographical pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I think it stands right up there with a Fun Home or with a Persepolis, and yeah, I think the Blankets comparison is a great one because of the way that it both takes its time in telling its story. It has this really wonderful sense of place, and then it has these little kind of surreal flourishes in it, which I would actually like to talk about more when we get into discussing the book. But the way that those little surrealistic moments inform you and tell you about the characters, and then also displace you from the characters. And actually something that you know, when you sent out the when we were talking about preparing this book club, I actually reached out to the reviewers again just to ask them, like, is there anything you want me to include? Do you have any thoughts about this? And one of the reviewers brought up that contrast between the very detailed settings of the book and then the very cartoony and caricatured characters,
Yeah.
which have this effect of both like welcoming you in and also displacing you. It creates this kind of unease, and it also makes the emotions just I think hit you that much harder because they're so simply drawn out on these characters' faces. And he compared it to Mouse, you know, the way that it achieves that like distancing. It's like initially distancing, but it ultimately pulls you in. It kind of subversively pulls you in, by making you respond to it, I think, more on an emotional level than if it had been done in a more realistic style. So yeah, I think I was absolutely blown away by this book, and I think it's right up there with some of those great works.
You know, I noticed in the book, any scenes, definitely any scenes that are setting the scene, buildings, houses, setting, any pictures of nature, you know, the close-ups of ants or feathers. They were
and the
always,
flower.
Yeah, the flowers, pages of just flowers, much more detailed, much more realistically rendered than any of the characters in the book, which is an interesting, like you said, sort of, it makes the events and the setting very real and concrete, while the characters are very sort of pliable and pull you in as being really accessible and easy to see ourselves in.
It's grounding and displacing at the same time. And for a story like this, I think I find that combination just incredibly effective.
Yeah. You mentioned Persepolis, and Bruce agreed in the comments, and I also agree. That one didn't come to my mind, but I think it's a good comparison because of the way in both books, the art style is similar, and I think also the art style kind of drives the story. And that might be a good way to kind of get into some of what you've mentioned about the cinematic aspects of it, or the surreal aspects of it, or some of what I want to talk about, which how he subverts the structure of comics, or uses the structure of comics to really inform the story and add more to the story. So I don't know what or for anybody here, what are your ideas on the art style, the pacing, or the particularly the surreal or dream aspects of the book? I don't know if anybody has anything they want to add, or if Jack, you want to jump in on that.
I mean, one thing that I want to say, and I'll keep it kind of brief, but the surreal scenes involving Travis, I think, all happen when he's younger. It opens up with that scene of him like floating away on that clown balloon, and then that is mirrored with the scene of David in, you know, lifting weights in his basement and seeing his dead brother there, and then being haunted by his brother's ghost. And then later, again, like just back to back, you get a scene of Travis again, like riding that big clown balloon, and then an insect pops it and he drowns in the ocean. And then it's mirrored by that scene of David going to the grave and then imagining himself being buried in the dirt. And those, you get a couple of those surreal or like more dreamlike things later in the book, but they all tend to be David's perspective. For Travis, that stops when when it jumps forward and he's an older, you know, he's in his teens. And for me, I think part of that is just how you illustrate the perspective of a child.
I think the scene where the scorpion pops the clown balloon, it's the last time we see the clown balloon, which was featured pretty heavily in the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
And I think it's the last dream sequence that he has before it goes into the 8 years later. And I thought that was really significant because it comes immediately after he sees David injecting heroin and tells his mom, and it almost like everything sort of the reality came crashing in at that moment, and that's kind of what that seemed like.
Yeah, and there's kind of a mirroring between the sharpness of the needle and the sharpness of the scorpion's tail. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you know, something I thought that was really interesting about the art style was the use of scribbles, textures, scribbling. All the lines are very loose, very, you know, it's drawn beautifully, but it has a childlike quality to it. And I felt that was, even though Travis's style is a little bit of that scribbly nature, I felt like he leaned into it more as a way of sort of emphasizing that everything that we're seeing in the story is through a child's eyes. And, you know, even that scene where he witnesses him doing heroin, you know, he doesn't understand the significance or the danger of it until after he sees his mom's reaction. And we're kind of just right there with him, innocent. He's saying, you know, oh, maybe he was giving himself medicine or something like that. So I think the book did a really good job through the pacing and the artwork and those moments of silence that you talked about, of really emphasizing, you know, a child's point of view.
And then, but at the same time, you know, because I was thinking about that moment of him doing heroin in front of his kid, and if we had just been offered that moment kind of on its own, like we would react with like straight horror, right? But we got those previous moments of seeing the way that he's haunted by that suicide in his life, seeing that interaction with his doctor where he's asking him for more. He's asking him for more pills, like he's asking him for the medication to keep it all at bay, and his doctor won't fill a prescription for him, and then him going out and getting heroin like as a substitute. And that, you know, when I was talking about empathy and I was talking about like understanding like Travis's efforts to have us be able to understand David's perspective, like that's what I was talking about. Because that scene reads totally differently if you don't have that context for who David is. You know, it becomes much more tragic, you know, knowing, or at least like inferring that this guy is trying. He's trying to keep it together. He's made an effort to like do something in his life, and we can sort of see the personal trauma and the context behind it. To then see him kind of reduced to this place where he's injecting heroin with his kid in the other room, like alone, it makes the scene much more sad, and much more tragic than if we had it on its own. And I think our response would have been a lot more revulsion and a lot more horror. It's a really fine balance, I think.
So one of the awesome things about the Excellence in Graphic Literature Awards is that when, you know, it's actually like in the rubric for the books, like when you're judging it, part of the things you're thinking about is, can this be used in a academic or classroom setting, whether that's college, high school, whether it's, you know, in a library or something like that. When we talked about Kiss Number 8 a couple of weeks ago with those creators, they said that teaching empathy in the classroom would be a great focus for that book, a great way to use that book. And I feel like, you know, that could be a really, you know, because they do touch on that empathy piece so hard, that could be another application for this book in an academic setting. Because especially for teens, you know, if you're not teaching those character traits like empathy, things like that, a lot of times they aren't learned. They have to be explicitly taught. So this book could lend itself to that really well.
Yeah.
And Jack, I think you're exactly right that he shows that very clearly in his choice to include all of that. You know, it's a very tragic story. It's a very human story, and he shows us how Dave went from a person he really admired and deteriorated through his own mental health struggles, through a cycle of addiction that is very familiar to people who've experienced it, and it made him a much more human character. Even at times in the book, he calls Dave a monster. He says, "I don't want anything to do with him," but he offers us, the reader, a much bigger picture of him, and I think that is really significant and shows a lot of empathy by them.
And when he says that, when he says he's a monster and he doesn't want anything to do with him, like he's responding as a 15 or 16-year-old kid, who's who's seen this guy abuse his mom. Like that's a totally legit reaction in that moment, and I never doubted his reaction in the moment. If anything, I admired his ability to, as an adult, as an artist, to be able to go back and look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah. Mentioning the mom, I thought his relationship with his mom and the way it changed, particularly over the 8-year difference, was really interesting. The book is dedicated to his mom, and the dedication page is even a little interesting. It's a mix of images of there's like Halloween images. There's
now I need to look at it.
Nest, there's a gun on there. It's really kind of and I think he portrays his mom as a very human person with flaws. And one of the questions I have on here is what do you guys, the readers, think of ultimately the takeaway of his relationship with his mom, or how it ends with, how does it portray his mom as a total story? I thought that was interesting. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in with a comment there.
I have thoughts, but I'm happy to let happy to let our audience.
I think we can keep talking, but I would love to hear from anybody in the audience that hasn't jumped in. So please do just jump in and interrupt us if you got something to say. But otherwise, Jack, if you got some comments there.
Well, especially because I'm talking about how developed David is as a character. I find his mom to be really underdeveloped, and that might be I think maybe one of the only weaknesses I can really point to in the book. His mom becomes a bit of becomes a bit of a cliche of like an abused woman. I don't necessarily see the same effort to understand why she keeps letting this guy back in. If he's made that effort, like I'm not seeing it on the page. And again, maybe that has to do partially with his perspective, with where he was when he was living this. When he's a teenager, he's got these strong feelings, he's got these strong beliefs, he's starting to be able to come into his own, and at the same time, he's totally beholden to the family circumstances around him. So he doesn't actually have very much power in his life to remove himself from his family. So when his mom decides that she's gonna welcome David back, there's not a whole lot he can do. And I feel like, just as a reader, I feel like maybe that anger is still pretty raw for him. I think there's only one scene. There's one scene fairly near the end of the book where he has his mom having a dream, and it's the only time that we get that same like shared perspective with his mom, and she's like having a dream of first meeting him.
Mm-hmm. So I think, yeah,
that still doesn't tell us a whole lot about where she is, you know, later, or why she keeps responding, or letting him back in. But
I had some thoughts here. So first off, thanks for hosting this. This is really fun. I'm glad we can have this discussion. But I totally agree, and I kind of read it as the idea of like the mom is kind of always reacting to what's going on, but never given a lot of like agency throughout the book. And it kind of seemed like how someone who was like in that trauma heavy situation as a youth would like put the blame on kind of that one side of the parent and say like, why aren't you protecting me? And like it shows, I think, in how that character is kind of represented throughout the book as being, I think, kind of like it feels like you're getting a sense of his childhood perception of her unintentionally or like subconsciously almost through the character development there. So that was sort of my thinking on that. And I found it really interesting how she doesn't really even have like a lot of like facial expression, and she doesn't have a lot of detail sometimes when it comes to like her reactions. And sometimes it feels like she's kind of just outside of the situation in a way.
Mm-hmm. I think she's like literally outside of the frame a lot of the time too.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I wonder if that was unintentional or intentional. It's one of those things that you could kind of point out from a kind of a psychological perspective, or really just something that's really unique to the book, and that it kind of leaves that impression on the reader.
Yeah.
I think Bruce had a comment or two to add in there. Bruce?
Yeah, thanks. I think that this was very intentional to do it that way, especially having gone through once to read it for the characterization, kind of get a sense of what I felt about the art, and then going through just looking at the art and seeing how that fit in with the scenes. And I think they're pretty much without exception when the characters are dreaming or in their own heads. It's a very, very complicated, intricate artwork. But when they're standing around talking to each other, it's almost like he hacked it out in a minute, artwork-wise. It's very scritchy and unfleshed out. So I think he might be making a comment that these people, in his head is complicated and he's dealing with things. And that applies to Dad Dave as well. When he's thinking, when he's in his own world, in his own head, it's very, very complicated, very, very dark. He's a shadow of Scribbles. But when he's standing there with other people, it's very, very big. Blank. The burgers were overcooked. That's a very sparse scene. So I think that was very intentional that when he's when Travis is just kind of living around people, it's very loose, and people are putting on their masks, and he's just seeing this very superficial scene with people, or remembering it as being very superficial. I think that another reason he might be like that, and I might be projecting, but I had similar situations with my family growing up, not nearly as tragic, but ultimately I can remember enough to relate to it. But when he's kind of living in his head, it's very complicated, and his dreams are very complicated. But when he's encountering other people, the people that I think he's making a statement now about how he remembers things. Because he's portraying his mom as very superficial. He's portraying Dave when he's around other people as very superficial. He's even portraying himself as very superficial. He's running around like Calvin and Hobbes with a big smile on his face and big circly eyes with no detail in them. So he might be saying something to the effect of, this is what I remember, but what I felt with my dreams was very, very complicated. And if you go through it too, and you look at all the secondary characters, that pass through, it feels like he's commenting that, wow, I kind of wish that I had been a little bit more aware of the people around me that were good, like the grandmother and the dog. And
oh yeah, there's that scene where he just leaves,
right,
and then it takes a couple beats on her in that empty room. Yeah.
right, and then the weird uncle who ends up drinking himself into the floor and stuff like that. And why would you put those in there if you're not commenting that, wow, maybe I kind of have a regret of spending all this mental energy on these toxic people, or people who were so involved in themselves, like his mother, frankly, that instead of the people who really were good and should have meant something.
Yeah.
So I'm just guessing, obviously.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point, Bruce. I feel like memories played a really prominent role in the book. And like you were talking about, certain memories, or even the entire trip to Uncle Bud's house, almost felt like an aside from the main plot. And there were moments. I remember there was an entire page dedicated to a tree and all the carvings in the tree. So and so, so and so. And to me, that felt like such and then it contributed to the surreal feeling. It felt like such a vivid memory, like maybe I don't remember exactly what got said that day, but I remember that tree. I remember what was carved into it. And the way he brings those random memories in that aren't always so random, where they don't feel random. Kind of one of those things that I wanted to touch on that I think I noticed that sort of, I believe is kind of playing into that memory idea, is the idea of Dave's sunglasses. So Dave's sunglasses, I think, are extremely important to the story. And if in looking at it, there are only 4 scenes in the entire book where we see him without his sunglasses. And to me, that was, for one, I was thinking, okay, he's remembering, he was a little kid, he's remembering this figure, Dad Dave. He probably remembers him always having sunglasses on. Even at night, he's always having sunglasses on. I'm gonna actually, maybe I'll just try to present my screen real quick to just show you guys this. Hopefully it will work. But yeah, actually, I'm not gonna mess with it. This will take too long. But the scenes where we don't see his sunglasses, I think the very first time we see him take his sunglasses off is after he has been kicked out of the family. He's hit Travis for the first time. He's at work, and one of his coworkers asks, "How's the family?" And there's a moment where he takes the sunglasses off and just rubs his eyes. It's the first time we ever see him remove them. Then that's on page 342. That's the first time we see him take his sunglasses off. On page 360, when he shows up at the house, he's hallucinating. He thinks that there's monsters after him, and they get the knives from the kitchen. That entire scene, he doesn't have his sunglasses on. The dream sequence where the mom has a dream and remembers meeting Dave for the first time. He doesn't have sunglasses on in that scene. And then 2 more scenes. His suicide, he doesn't have sunglasses on. And then at the very, very end of the book, there's a panel where they're at the pool. He's remembering the pool, and it specifically shows that his sunglasses are sitting on the side of the pool away from him. So, I've got some ideas.
Oh yeah, that's like.
Yeah, very
good.
Very on the nose.
Very obvious there. Yeah.
And I think that also plays into your thought about, why does he end with this scene, and does it show forgiveness? And I think the sunglasses kind of can add to that, or maybe, to me, maybe show a little bit of that forgiveness. So
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody had any thoughts right off the bat, or if I should just launch into my theory here.
I'm happy to hear your theory.
Well, to
I mean,
me,
I think
yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I was just gonna say, like, it from talking about it from the kid's perspective, right? We're thinking about it from the kid's perspective. The because his eyes are big and wide, and you can see right into them, right? You can see everything that's going on inside him, and we know that Dave had so much going on here that he could not express or was having trouble dealing with and letting out. And so, you know, I was kind of wondering, like, did he actually like wear those sunglasses all the time, or was that just like an artistic thing that, you know, Travis is using to represent how closed off and how David wouldn't let anyone into his inner reality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's eyes play such like a big piece throughout the story, you know, like looking at like the page where the eyes are over the top of the house and that like looking down, right? And the fact that those are the actually only what's the word, like fully realized eyes that kind of show up throughout some of the pieces of the story, that the idea like of each of the characters' eyes like representing something about them. I didn't think about that, but now, Will, you got that cooking in my brain. So
yeah, you know, to me, I think like Matt was saying, you know, sunglasses, you know, they close us off from each other. You know, somebody's wearing sunglasses, they're sort of protected. We can't really. To me, it's about seeing him for his true self. And I'm thinking, you know, he's this young kid. This dad, Dave, he drives muscle cars. He's super cool. He's got the mustaches. He's got these cool sunglasses. And then as the story progresses, there are these moments where he sees Dave as, you know, tortured, flawed, dangerous.
There's there's that moment where, usually right there, where he draws his back.
Yes.
That is like, it's so intimate. It's so human. Like it's just incredible.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's definitely one of those moments where he's seeing something else.
Yeah, and I think it's about like you know, it's about like showing him for his true self. And I guess, you know, the idea is over the years he learned that the true self was, you know, a really kind of a scary figure. But then I think by ending the book with the scene going all the way back to the beginning, the very first memory, and showing, okay, here's the memory I have of him, and in this memory he wasn't wearing his sunglasses, is a way to for him to say, you know, his true self was scary, dangerous, abusive, but there was another aspect of his true self, and it was that person at the pool with me that day. And so I think this page in particular, I think if there's any page that shows forgiveness, I think this would be the one, to me, as I read it.
and I feel like for me that was like maybe the only, for me personally, like that was really the part of the story where I felt the most empathy for that character, like seeing like, oh, like this life that this person is leading is like, you know, under the surface they're dissolving, and it kind of was really, it just is like beating them down, and you're sort of seeing it finally, the mask has come off literally. And we're seeing like so that really good. Cool. And like and the parallel between that frame with the eyes by the like with the knife in the pool, and then to compare to like the eyes over the house, just some really interesting either conscious or subconscious stuff that Travis Andro is doing there.
Yeah, very, very much so. One more thing I just have to throw out before we run out of time. You know, a lot of people have talked about how the story pulls you in. It's so immersive. And I would point out that there is not a single border or gutter or any sort of panel structure whatsoever. Every single panel and every single page is all bleed. And I think that's a big part of how it pulls you in and is so immersive and surreal feeling too.
Yeah.
So I've got plenty more to talk about, but I know we're running low on time here, so maybe we'll have to save that for another time.
I think Adam's comment on the side there about it being good in mental health settings,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that it demonstrates the way that addiction and trauma impact the whole family. I think that's really good. That there's a lot that's potentially therapeutic about it as well as educational. And I hope that this is a book that, you know, like some of those other ones that we talked about, like Fun Home, like Blankets, that has a really long life, and that gets that level of attention and that level of youth. So.
I think going back to our first conversation about whether this is young adult or adult, you know, my thought there was that maybe not every young adult could handle this book or would gravitate to it. But I feel that any young adult who has had personal experience with something along these lines would instantly recognize it and be drawn into it the way that we all were.
Yeah, I think so.
So I think it has a lot of value in that mental health focus.
Cool.
Yeah.
Will, I have a question about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
About what you just said. Do you think that if someone like a teenager, a 16-year-old picked up this book, do you think they would be able to grasp what he's getting at? In other words, this seems very cathartic for Will looking back 20 years later. So I'm wondering if those themes, they might look at it and identify with it, especially if there's abuse and things like that in the family, but what would they be able to take out of it that's therapeutic?
So I think, you know, having worked with a lot of teens, I think one thing that is so powerful for anybody, but teens especially, is the feeling that you're not alone, right? The feeling that someone has, your experience is not, it may be unique to you, but others have had similar experiences and can relate. And so I think that element by itself could be powerful. And while this book, I don't know if it has the healing aspect, you know, that other works might, I think being able to see something close to that experience, if that's something that they've also experienced, could be powerful. And then, like we talked earlier, that empathy piece, and just knowing like some of the silent struggles that others are going through.
Cool.
Yeah.
And I think it's so layered too that teenagers in that kind of situation would get something out of it, but adults can get something out of it too. It's very deceiving. It's much more layered and nuanced than it appears on the inside. In fact, I have conspiracy theories about it. Feels just a little bit like he's trying to give us a whole bunch of Easter eggs in there. I don't know if anybody else sensed that too.
There's definitely stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, sort of logical sense.
To me,
yeah.
Oh, I just think to me it contributes a lot to that surreal feeling. It's almost like the story is subconsciously driven, where we kind of are meandering through his memories, and he's sort of introducing these things that might be Easter eggs or might hint at something else. Or even for me, I think I found just his sort of thoughtfulness in pacing with memories brought up personal memories of my own. And I think there's just this sort of feeling of you open up the first page and you just kind of let go, and your subconscious just kind of pulls you through the story. And I think that's why it's so emotional at the end. By the time you're sort of done with it, it's like, man, I'm kind of tired, like I'm a little emotionally pulled through the ringer here. It's and I read a couple of interviews with him, and it seemed that, you know, for him it was such a personal story. It seemed that it was his subconscious that was writing it. It wasn't so much, you know, I need to include this scene because it contributes to the story. but I need to include this scene because when I think about that day, that's what I remember. You know?
Yeah.
I read an interview with him too that he said that writing and drawing this book was much more therapeutic than years and years of therapy was talking about it.
Yeah.
And I think you can sense that too. It was very therapeutic, and you are sensing, you're feeling what he's feeling.
Yeah.
I should go out and seek out some interviews. I'm curious how this relates to some of the comic strip work that he's done. And yeah, I'm really anxious to see what he does next.
Something I thought was really interesting, a side plot throughout the whole story is his sort of growth and development into a comic book writer illustrator. From drawing as a little kid, there's an entire scene where he meets his mentor. They discuss comic books, and he leaves, and it's just kind of back to the story with his dad. But I think it doesn't seem to add anything to the story about Dad Dave, but it adds to his character as a whole person, and it being a much more personal story. I thought that was really interesting that he included all of that stuff.
I actually agree now that you think about it, because there was a point where it seemed like the book was more about Dad Dave than it was about Travis. But occasionally these little scenes would come back to ground us back into it being Travis's story, observing Dad Dave, rather than Dad Dave's story and Travis is just kind of on the outside.
Yeah.
And I think he does a really good job of like capturing that sort of, it's almost like you're in there with like a childlike attention. It goes dreamy. There's like a clock on the wall that's the cuckoo, and you can't stop. Like it's the funnel. You funnel the perception to that one thing. Like you're trying as a kid to, avoid like looking at the issue or like thinking about what's going on, or like that's what you remember from that house is that one clock or something like that. That one detail that kind of gets focused on. And I think it's a really great way to show like that kind of, it almost feels like you're in that kind of childhood, like you're kind of in that memory world where you're not really sure like sometimes what's real and what's not. And then some pieces of it are almost hazy, like something's just out of view. Like he's trying to kind of bring it to the surface, but he just can't get there. So there's a lot of really great stuff there. Yeah.
The one thing that you can be certain on is where that cuckoo clock was in the room and what it looked like, right? That vivid piece of memory.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the sunglasses. Like that's probably what the whole story is built around. These little images, these little like memory, like sense pieces that he's bringing back to the forefront. So, yeah, it really captures for me like that feeling of like just being a kid and kind of like trying to move through this dramatic world, but not really knowing exactly like how I fit in. So you're just sort of picking up things as you go.
Definitely. I thought the role that the car played in the book was really interesting. Dave's car being this muscle car that started out as being something really, really cool, that then became an image in his nightmares, something he was afraid of, something he kept thinking he saw in the corner. And then Dave came back into his life. They go get a driver's license together. Dave buys him a car. They split. They have a falling out. Yet he's still driving the car that Dave gave him. And then, the car plays a pretty heavy thread all the way through the book. And I thought that was kind of interesting how the car developed along with their relationship and changed the way he changed his views of Dave and how he felt about him.
It's such a marker of adulthood too. And it wouldn't be surprising, that the thing that you would remember about a figure like that is their car.
Yeah.
I think that's probably close to our time.
Yeah.
I am on the phone, sweetie. Here, come here. Somebody wants to say hi. No? Okay.
Nope.
All right. Well,
We'll peek.
thank you very much, everybody. It was such a pleasure to get to present this book, to get to explore it more. Thank you, Will, for all of your insight. Yeah, I feel like it just grew my appreciation for it, and I'm more and more proud that that this was our winner this year. So.
Excellent. And then for anyone listening, our next book club, we are now moving into our adult winners for the EGL Awards.
Talking to somebody from work. Huh?
So in 2 weeks, on August 7th, we will be doing our EGL book club for the adult fiction winner, which is The Hard Tomorrow. So we would love to see you guys join us for that and have another in-depth conversation about, you know, the awesome things about that book and how that book can be used in classrooms or libraries and insights that we pulled from there. So we hope that you guys can join us. Again, that is August 7th at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. But yeah, I'll go ahead and say from Pop Culture Classroom, from Denver Pop Culture Con, and the Excellence in Graphic Literature Awards, thank you to all of you guys for joining us today. Really, really appreciate the awesome conversation. And Jack, all the work that you guys did as jurors to pick the cream of the crop.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It was a really great experience, and hope to see you guys again next year.
Awesome. And thank you, Will, for hosting our chat today.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will see everybody in a couple weeks when we talk about The Hard Tomorrow.
All right.
Thanks, Jack and Will.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys. Y'all take care.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye. You say bye-bye?
Bye.